Hi, everybody. Welcome to I've actually lost count. I don't know how many of these we've done, a couple, to our MBTA Communities Public Forum. My name is Tim Zerwinski. I'm the Director of Planning and Community Development. I'm joined by Josh Eckhart-Lee, the Assistant Director. So what we're going to do tonight, I'm going to fire up my PowerPoint. I want to get, right to it. I do want to just address, it's been a little bit of an adventure scheduling this one. We've been trying to do these forums on a relatively monthly basis. We had scheduled one for last week. That was my fault. Did not pay close enough attention to the calendar. We had scheduled it for the night of Yom Kippur, which we certainly don't want to be scheduling public meetings and interrupting people who are participating in that holiday. So we pushed the meeting to tonight. We had booked the Council on Aging as a venue. There is construction going on at the parking lot at the Council on Aging. I don't know if anyone was quite aware of what the condition would be tonight, and it turns out that it's just not available for parking. So we thought, with the amount of interest in this meeting, and the ability to have an accessible facility, we wanted to play it safe and switch to a remote format so that the most possible people could participate without being stymied by showing up to the Council on Aging and not being able to find a place to park. So apologies if there was disruptive to anybody. But again, we're trying to, adapt to circumstances as they come. And Zoom gives us an option to do that. So thanks everybody for being here. I am going to share my screen and we can get started. We've got a pretty full agenda in terms of updates, but as always, we want to leave as much time as we can, for questions, on the material. So just give me a quick minute and we can get right to it. Okay. Okay, Josh, can you see my screen?
I can. You're all set,
Okay.
Tim.
Wonderful. So the agenda for tonight, we're in the middle of our introduction, so we can check that off the to-do list. We'll be doing, as we always do, a quick recap of the MBTA community zoning requirements. I do see a number of frequent flyers in the participants list, so this all should be old hat to you. But out of respect for people who may be joining us for the first time, we want to make sure that we're all have an equal understanding of what we're talking about. So we'll do a brief recap of the MBTA communities law and what the requirements and the guidelines are. We've got an update on technical assistance that we've been receiving. Our usual compliance modeling, district boundaries, kind of the meat and potatoes of zoning. We've been working with the design and planning firm named Util with that. That name may be familiar to folks. We've got some additional refinements of the district boundaries, of the dimensional parameters therein. But a new bit of assistance that we've gotten an update on. I think people have been really looking forward to hearing a little bit more about the fiscal impact analysis that the planning board has commissioned. So we've got some preliminary results on that analysis that we'll go through. We've got an update on the town's correspondence with the MBTA regarding the classification of the Mattapan trolley as rapid transit. And then finally, question and comment period, and then we'll talk about next steps. So as everyone is hopefully aware, we are on Zoom. So we'll just go really quickly through some of the functionality. Josh and myself are presenters. We're up here on the screen. Folks that are attendees of the meeting are out in the attendees room, for lack of a better term. Just like if we were on the Council on Aging, I'd be up at the podium, you'd be sitting down, same type of setup. When we do open the question and comment period, there are two ways that you can go about this. We've got the raise hand function. If you click that, a little hand will show up next to your name, and it'll put you in a queue of other folks that have raised their hands. We'll take those hands as they come. in order. There's also a Q&A button where you can put a question. Oh, Josh.
Sorry, the Q&A button is not enabled this evening. So it'll
Okay.
just be through raised hands.
Okay, apologies for that. We do not have the Q&A enabled, so it'll be strictly raising hands. But again, if we were in the room together, there's no Q&A button in the room, so this should all be familiar to folks. And then if you're joining us on the phone, you can raise your hand by pressing *9, and then when you're called upon, you can mute and unmute yourself by pressing *6. Those are the phone functions. So once we're done with the presentation, we will invite people to speak in the order that they've raised their hands. Like I said, you raise your hand, you'll go into a queue. That second bullet, unfortunately, is not operative, so I apologize. And then just to sort of give everyone a chance, we're going to do our best to limit comments and questions to 3 minutes. If you feel like you've got additional questions or your question wasn't answered, feel free to raise your hand again. You'll go to the back of the line. And hopefully, if we've got enough time, we'll be able to get to folks if you feel you need a little bit more time. So just as a reminder, everything we do around MBTA communities is on the MBTA communities page on the Planning and Community Development Department website. One thing that is sometimes a little bit of confusion, we do have a link that's kind of a standing link, townofmilton.org/MiltonMBTA. You can type that in. But if you're on the town website, this is on the department website. So under departments, not boards and committees, you'll find Planning and Community Development. And then that left-hand menu has the MBTA Communities webpage. Every presentation we give, every recording of every forum, any new information we get from the state, we will post up on that page. Josh does an incredible job of, the morning after, first thing he shows up in the morning, he's updating that website with new information, if we have a meeting or if we have an update. So you can count on that to be as up to date as possible. So what is the MBTA Communities Law? In January of 21, the state legislature and then eventually Governor Baker signed a bill that added a new Section 3A to Mass General Laws, Chapter 40A, which is the Zoning Act. Everything we do around zoning kind of stems from 40A. And so that's how the state can kind of pass laws that will affect every town in the Commonwealth is by amending the Zoning Enabling Act. And it requires that an MBTA community, which is defined in statute, but as a shorthand, anywhere that's got a train station or a bus station or a ferry port is an MBTA community, shall have at least one zoning district of reasonable size in which multifamily housing, which is defined as 3 or more units in one building, is permitted as of right and then meets other criteria set forth in the statute. The minimum gross density of the overall zoning district has to be 15 units per acre. Not more than half a mile from a commuter rail station, subway station, ferry terminal, or bus station, if applicable. You can't put age restrictions in your zoning, and your zoning has to be suitable for families with children. And the penalties for noncompliance that are laid out in the statute are revoking of your eligibility for certain state grant funds, including MassWorks, Housing Choice, and the local capital projects funds. So let me just make sure I'm in the right spot. So the law is pretty short. And I've said this a bunch of times, but this slide basically, it's a paraphrase, but it's not that much longer than the actual text of the law. And so one of the things that the law does is explicitly authorizes the State Housing Agency, which is the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, to create guidelines that will help towns understand how to comply with these requirements. What does suitable for families with children mean? For instance, that's not spelled out in the statute. That's something that needs to be spelled out in more specific guidelines. And so the guidelines that HLC, which is Housing and Livable Communities, have set up has added additional kind of constraints on our zoning district. So the reasonable size means that the district has to be at least 50 acres, and it has to have a unit capacity of at least 2,461 units. And what this means is the zoning district that you create has to have the potential to create at least 2,461 units. And then at least 50% of that unit capacity has to be within the transit area, which again is the area defined by a half-mile radius around a transit station. All of our transit stations are on the Mattapan line. Cedar Grove captures part of Milton, Milton Station, Central Ave, Valley Road, Capon Street, and then Mattapan Station also captures a bit of Milton. So that's the area that we're talking about. So we've been working with technical assistance providers, primarily Util, which is the firm that I referenced earlier, to use the state's compliance model, which is a software tool that the state has developed that basically has all of the constraints inherent in the guidelines kind of programmed into this tool. And what they ask towns to do is to input the geography that they're looking to test, which is sort of the parcels in your zoning district, and then also the dimensional parameters. So all of the typical things around zoning that we tend to regulate: height, density, setbacks, required open space, required parking. You plug all that data into the compliance model, and the tool sort of spits out some outputs that tell you, are you compliant on this metric? Is your district at least 50 acres? Is at least half of it within the transit area, et cetera, et cetera. It's a really powerful tool, but also pretty complicated to work with. And it's been taking us, quite some time to really, pin down, what we think would be, a good set of districts that meet not just the state's requirements, but also our own kind of local requirements. So there are options for compliance inherent in these guidelines. No one is saying you've got to do something here in this very specific area, and it's got to be, X density, and it's got to have Y setbacks. There are broad requirements in the statute and the guidelines, and what the state is expecting is for towns to work within those constraints and develop something that works for them. So the location of the districts within a half a mile of transit is determined by how much developable area exists within that radius. And so when you think about drawing a circle where the center is Milton Station, a significant portion of that circle is going to be in Lower Mills and Dorchester. And so our area is reduced because of the location of our transit stops. And so the guidelines allow us to cite as much as 50% of our compliant zoning districts outside of that half-mile transit radius. That's just an acknowledgement of the reality of where some of these stations are. It's a matter of fairness. A town like Newton, which, every station is very, smack dab in the middle of town, has a lot more developable area than we do. We're allowed to create multiple sub-districts, and that means geographies can be different. Dimensional requirements can be different. We don't have to have one blanket set of zoning requirements over an entire district. The constraints here is that at least half of the district needs to be in one contiguous chunk, and sub-districts need to be a minimum of 5 acres. So you can't zone a handful of parcels here, a handful of parcels there. They've got to be a decent size, and at least half of them have to be contiguous. So there are certain cities and towns that, by virtue of their existing zoning and by virtue of their existing development patterns, could potentially count existing zone capacity towards their requirements. City of Cambridge is a good example. They are not working nearly as hard on MBTA communities as we are, because they have so much existing multifamily housing and so much existing multifamily zoning, that it's really a matter of kind of tweaking what they've got as opposed to creating new multifamily zoning. We do not currently have any districts that could be considered compliant. Most of the land in Milton is zoned for single family housing. Where we have allowed townhouse and multifamily development, it's by special permit, which is distinct from by right, which is what the requirement of the law is. And much of our multifamily development is age restricted. So you think about how many units there are in Winter Valley, in Unquity House, in Fuller Village. Not only are those all created by special permit processes, but they're also age restricted, which is a no-no under the law. So the dimensional requirements, again, we have a fair amount of latitude in terms of height, setbacks, and density. They don't have to be uniform across subdistricts as long as the average of all the subdistricts meet the law's minimum requirements for density, reasonable size, and by right permitting. So the really simple example is if you have one subdistrict that comprises half of your total district, that can have a density of 5 units per acre, which is far below the 15 units per acre requirement in the statute. As long as the other half has a density of 25 units per acre. So that all averages out to 15 units per acre. So our subdistricts are working a little bit more complexly than that, but the principle is the same. If you've got a low density somewhere, that's okay, as long as you make up for it with a higher density elsewhere. And it all kind of comes out in the wash. So the effects of noncompliance: if at any point HLC determines that an MBTA community is not in compliance with Section 3A, that MBTA community will not be eligible for funds from the Housing Choice Initiative, the Local Capital Projects Fund, and MassWorks, which is a major infrastructure grant program that the Commonwealth runs. In subsequent updates to their guidelines, HLC has said that they will also take noncompliance into account when they make decisions on 13 additional grant programs that agency manages. So when the state gives out money via a grant process, these are competitive grants. A lot of different towns are angling for this, free money from the state, and the state puts out requirements. They say you've got to do this, you've got to do that, you've got to do that. MBTA communities compliance is now going to be one of those parameters for 13 different grant programs, some of which the town of Milton, currently benefits from, including the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, which we've gotten significant funding from that grant program in the past. So those are real consequences that are known. One thing that is, I still say unknown, but getting clearer the closer we get to our compliance deadline, is that both Governor Healy and Attorney General Campbell have indicated that housing is a priority and that noncompliance is not an option. In addition to the state, outside nonprofit and advocacy organizations have, basically committed themselves to suing towns on fair housing grounds if they refuse to comply. The town of Holden was the first community to be subject to a lawsuit by the group Lawyers for Civil Rights. They've come out and said, we're not complying. Don't wait for us to comply because we're not going to do it. And so they've been sued by an outside advocacy group. Up on the screen right now is excerpts from a advisory that Attorney General Andrea Campbell issued earlier this year around compliance. And it basically says, and I'll read the second paragraph just so everyone, is clear about this. MBTA communities that fail to comply with the law's requirements also risk liability under federal and state fair housing laws. The Massachusetts Anti-Discrimination Law and Federal Fair Housing Act prohibit towns and cities from using their zoning power for a discriminatory purpose or with discriminatory effect. An MBTA community may violate these laws if, for example, its zoning restrictions have the effect of unfairly limiting housing opportunities for families with children, individuals who receive housing subsidies, people of color, people with disabilities, or other protected groups. So we are still in the preparation period. Our deadline for compliance is December 31st, 2023. That is the same deadline for compliance as 11 other what are called rapid transit communities. These are communities that the HLC guidelines have determined, communities that benefit from the best form of transit, red line, green line, blue line, orange line, and so have the highest obligation under this act to produce zoning that has the potential to produce the most housing on the fastest timetable. And so, when December 31st rolls around, we'll see, who complies and who doesn't. Every one of the rapid transit communities that I've been in touch with, and I've been in meetings with representatives of all of them, are committed to hitting that deadline of December 31st, and are working diligently to get there. So hopefully we don't see any issues with noncompliance in this first deadline. We certainly don't want to be the ones that are rolling the dice on that. So the planning board recently requested an opinion from town council regarding basically the sort of the legal relationship between the statute, which is a law that's passed by the legislature and signed by the governor, and the guidelines, which are written by a regulatory agency. And have a sort of potentially different status under law than an actual kind of statute. There's a question about whether the guidelines hold the same legal validity as statute does. And this is again an excerpt from a memo that town council recently provided the planning board. We agree with the Attorney General's analysis in this regard. That's a reference to the previous advisory. We also note, as does the AG, that under home rule, a municipality wields authority to enact local zoning only provided that such zoning is not inconsistent with constitutional or statutory requirements. In our further opinion, in the event of a relevant legal challenge, a court likely would afford substantial deference to HLC in interpreting the HLC guidelines broadly to satisfy the legislative purposes that the AG advisory summarizes. And town council concludes, in view of the above legal authority, we are compelled to underscore the Attorney General's cautions that emphasize that non-compliant MBTA communities could be subject to civil enforcement actions and potentially liability under state and federal anti-discrimination laws if the required zoning districts are not created. In our opinion, these potential penalties, in addition to the risk of the loss of certain state funding, are a significant counterweight to arguments that the guidelines are beyond HLC's authority to promulgate and enforce. I just want to underscore here the importance of not just getting this right, but getting it right to a point that town council is, or town meeting, excuse me, is confident in passing zoning, because if we don't pass compliant zoning, there's a pretty dangerous world of legal repercussions out there waiting for us. So what does compliance look like? As I mentioned earlier, our zoning district must satisfy several variables, including being at least 50 acres in size, having a zone capacity of at least 2461 units, and an overall density of 15 units per acre. There are additional requirements that we'll go into a little bit later when we're actually looking at the districts and the dimensional parameters. So again, we've been working with technical assistance providers. If you've been to these forums, you're familiar with kind of the ebb and flow of how we've been, working in this model and kind of trying to figure out how these districts should operate. So I'm going to, share what is, not quite the final version, because again, this is work that the planning board has been doing. Planning board is still not, committed to, a single set of sub-districts. They're still doing their due diligence, doing their work, trying to come up with the best set of sub-districts with the best dimensional parameters that kind of meet as many of the town's planning priorities as possible. But, this map here is a result of multiple iterations of testing different sub-districts all around town and kind of figuring out, what works and what actually kind of gets us to compliance. So this is a town-wide map. Hopefully everyone recognizes town of Milton. All of the different half-mile radiuses around transit stations are here. You can see at the top and the right is kind of where all the action is, for town of Milton. And we'll get to a little bit of a closer up map in a minute, but on the left-hand side, you see this key that shows the different sub-districts that we're talking about. And so, we'll look at the next map, which has a little bit of a closer view so you can see it. So going from left to right, and I'll try to key these to the colors. The pink district is what we're calling the Blue Hills Parkway corridor, which is kind of along Blue Hills Parkway down to, I can't tell exactly what street that is, but it kind of dips below the intersection of Brook Road and Blue Hills Parkway. The purple district is around Unquity House. That's our Mattapan Station sub-district. This is an example of something that we're trying to do with this zoning, which is, as I mentioned earlier, we don't have any compliant districts, but we do have some multifamily housing that we can, we can't take advantage of the underlying zoning, but from a practical standpoint, we can take advantage of the fact that multifamily housing already exists And we can choose to sort of rezone those areas, so that sort of the net increase in multifamily housing is less dramatic than if it was all sort of blank slate zoning. So we're creating a sub-district around Unquity House, again, which already has multifamily housing on it. The big district in the middle, which is this bluish greenish color, is what we're calling the transit area triplex. It's firmly within the transit area within that half-mile radius. Triplex is just another term for a three-unit house. You'll see later on that the main parameter in this sub-district is, just like today, it's one house on one lot. What this parameter is going to be is effectively three houses on one 7,500 square foot lot. So that's a significant portion of our zoning district here. It's a little bit tough to tell the color on these next couple because there's some hatching involved that I'll explain in a minute. But that the rest of that area, which is in sort of green and yellow, are Milton Station districts, and that's divided between west and east. West, generally lining up with the Central Avenue Business District. East, generally aligning with sort of the northern portion of the Milton Village Business District. And that Milton Station Bridge, light lime green district in the middle is, the current site of 36 and 50 Elliott Street. So again, existing multifamily housing, we're zoning underneath it. Again, 50 Elliott Street is, within the last 10 years has been built. The likelihood of that being redeveloped under new zoning is very low. So that's a situation where, we'll get credit for a certain number of units under MBTA communities, but the likelihood of there being redevelopment in the near future is again relatively low, and that'll be a kind of a theme that you see throughout these sub-districts. We'll explain why they're hatched in a minute, but just sort of put a pin in that. The orange districts, sort of the top, are our Granite Avenue districts. There's divided between north and south. North is the 2 Granite Avenue site. That's the Flatley office building. The Granite Avenue South District is the State DPW yard and park and ride lot, and then also the American Legion Hall on Granite Ave. And then finally, in the lower right-hand corner is our East Milton sub-district, which generally lines up with the borders of the East Milton business district. So these are the districts that the planning board has been working on. We've been talking about other districts, in the past couple months, down on Brush Hill Road, down on Randolph Ave, portions on Blue Hill Ave and Truman Parkway. All of those, for various reasons, didn't really work out. And so these have kind of always been in the mix, and we've been refining them to the point where, we think that they provide a path towards compliance that meets a lot of our priorities. So one quick note, and I'll flip back really quick. These sort of hatched areas here, the yellow and the green hatched areas, Milton Station West and Milton Station East, we are currently contemplating designating those as mandatory mixed use zones. So one thing that was a source of a lot of debate when the HLC guidelines first came out was that because the statute deals only with multifamily housing, the guidelines prohibited you from requiring mixed use development. You could always allow it as one of your uses. You could always allow ground floor commercial, and if someone wants to build it, they can. But if they don't, they're not required to. A lot of towns who were interested in zoning in their business districts because they're near transit, they're amenity rich, they're good places for residential development, balked at that a little bit, because when you create a by right zoning scheme that only allows for multifamily, you run the risk of someone buys a commercial building and builds an apartment building, which is great, but then, you've lost a bit of your, commercial tax base and a little bit of the sort of vitality that made your business district an attractive place to develop in the first place. That's a risk. There's also the chance that someone would definitely want to do mixed use. And so, it's a little bit of an unknown, but a lot of towns, really thought that HLC should rethink their guidelines and come up with a way to allow towns to require mixed use so that they could confidently zone in their commercial districts without running the risk of losing commercial tax base. So HLC amended their guidelines and created an allowance for what they're calling mandatory mixed use districts, which is simply a district where you can say, if you want to build here, you've got to do ground floor commercial, period. So the new guidelines are complicated to say the least, and it's because again the statute that enables the guidelines only deals with multifamily housing. So HLC had to come up with a creative and complicated workaround to kind of make this fit into the statutory requirements. So we are allowed to create a sub-district that includes up to 25% of our unit capacity and make that a mandatory mixed-use district. It technically becomes a not compliant 3A district. So all of those different requirements for contiguity and for area in the transit zone and all of that, the mandatory mixed use zone kind of is out of that mix, except for the purposes of unit capacity. So in discussions with the planning board and with our technical assistance consultants, we decided to work on the sort of the Milton Village and Central Avenue business districts as mandatory mixed use zones. One thing that I will tell you is, because we can only go up to 25% of our total unit capacity, we could not do both Milton Village and East Milton because that would be too much and it wouldn't meet the requirements of the amended guidelines. What we're doing in East Milton is doing our best to set the by right zoning level at a credible level, but if you've been following the work of the planning board for the past several years, you know that we've been doing a lot of planning in East Milton, doing a lot of visioning work about what that neighborhood sees as its future in terms of the built environment. And, before MBTA communities was even a thing, we had been embarking on a rezoning process in East Milton. And so what our goal is to, use East Milton as an MBTA communities district, but leave enough slack in those zoning requirements that the special permit zoning that we are in the process of creating is the more attractive development option for property owners there. And under that scheme, you can require mixed use, you can require affordable housing, you can require, all of the goodies that we like to put in special permit zoning. And so we felt that was going to hopefully adequately, again, protect that that East Milton commercial district in a way that we didn't have to use the mandatory mixed use zone over there. It's complicated. If people have questions about that, we can definitely walk through it in a little bit more detail. So now I'm gonna share some slides directly from UTL. They've been meeting with the planning board on a pretty regular basis over the last probably more than 6 weeks, and even before that, kind of doing work behind the scenes. Multiple iterations of compliant sub-districts, always getting feedback from the planning board about what their priorities are, and really have kind of pinned down a pathway to compliance that meets all of the stated priorities and stated constraints that the planning board has articulated, or at least attempts to satisfy them. So, that's using the Milton Station district as a mandatory mixed use. East Milton Square, zoning it to a relatively low level, but still, helpful for our compliance metrics. So not zoning more than 2.5 stories in East Milton. Keeping the minimum lot size in the transit area at least 7,500 square feet. And then not letting the total zoned capacity of all of our sub-districts come in too far above the 2,461 unit capacity threshold that we have. It's a thing to keep in mind as you're sort of, doing this stuff, that you can create a zoning district that, you think is very fair and, treats everyone right and has a minimum lot size that, is not too small and doesn't, pave the way for a massive, redevelopment. And then, by virtue of the way that the compliance model is counting these districts, you're up to 3,500 units in unit capacity, which is, way above our minimum threshold. And so you've got to kind of peel back and say, what's causing these numbers to kind of balloon in the way they are, and that's something the planning board has been interested in, of not going too far above that minimum. Um, so this is a summary chart of the inputs and the outputs of the zoning districts that we showed on that map earlier. So on the left side, you've got a list of all of the sub-districts. And then the columns across the top are kind of divided between inputs and outputs. And some of these inputs, like I said, you punch the sort of zoning parameters into the model and you say, what's the maximum units per acre, maximum units per lot, minimum lot size, parking minimums, height, parking coverage, building coverage, minimum open space. These are parameters that are typically in zoning, and that will affect the number of units that could potentially be built on a lot. So if you took away the 45 units per acre maximum in Granite Avenue North, for instance, you may get more than 171 units out of that, out of a parcel in that district. But because you've set that parameter at, we don't want more than 45 units per acre, that starts to now limit the unit capacity. Similarly, if you set the building height at 15 stories as opposed to 6 stories, you may get a jump in unit capacity. So all of these inputs kind of work together to constrain a site so that you're not seeing 1,000 units on the DPW yard, for instance. And so what we've done, just kind of to kind of walk you through, and in the Granite Avenue area, again, because it's there's a residential neighborhood there, but it's bordered significantly by the river, the highway. There are fewer residential abutters there than there are in other sub-districts. It's a little bit more remote than some of the other sub-districts that we're looking at. This is an area where a little bit of a higher density was kind of deemed to be appropriate. So 45 units per acre. Just to give you an indication of what that looks like, the Hendry's building at 131 Elliott Street, recently constructed, that is about 40 units per acre. So if you want to think about 45 units per acre, a little bit bigger than that building, we'll get you to that number. So it seems like a lot, but it's a building type that the town of Milton has kind of already approved, in different areas of town. And then also note that the maximum building height in these districts, 6 stories in the north at the 2 Granite Ave site, that's already a 5-story building on that site, and then 4.5 stories in the south. What we've really tried to do is peg these dimensional parameters as much as possible to either existing zoning, which people are comfortable with, have lived with for almost 100 years, or to the dimensional parameters of existing multifamily buildings. So, the Milton Station, parcels are also zoned for 40 units per acre. 88 Wharf Street is a little bit under that. 50 Elliott Street is a little bit under that. So that's a level that, is not so far outside of the realm of what exists today, that it's seriously disruptive and out of place. So what these, I won't walk through every single output, and all of this stuff is up on our website under that resources for MBTA communities page, but the outputs are what's important. So the unit capacity number, again, our minimum target is 2461. This scheme gets us a little bit over at 2617. The acreage needs to be 50 acres. We're healthily above that, at 146 acres. The overall density of these sub-districts is just over the minimum requirement at 15.2 units per acre. And now you might say, wait a sec, we zoned for 45 units per acre at Granite Avenue North. Where did we get 15 from? If you look at the model density of all of these districts, some of them are really high, and that's because the overall acreage of some of these sites is a big number. That number gets chipped down because of wetlands, because of roadways, because of all sorts of other things, so that the model density is actually higher than what the minimum set density is. But all that being said, the Granite Avenue district, 45 units per acre, model density of 65 units per acre, is only a 3.6 acre site. Whereas the transit area triplex, that blue district, is, the model density is 5.9 units per acre, but that's 82 acres. That's a big sub-district compared to the other ones. And so all of these numbers start to kind of interact with each other and kind of add up to that 15.2 units per acre. So this scheme gets us to compliance, and this is the result of a significant amount of can we adjust this building height? Can we adjust this overall density? Can we adjust this max units per acre? Should we think about other sub districts elsewhere in town? They've all yielded this. You see, this is option 1N. That means there was options A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, and here we are at N. So this is kind of the latest and greatest from our technical assistance providers. The planning board has seen this, they've discussed this, have not sort of come down in any direction yet in terms of what they want to move forward with, but this is sort of the latest, and sort of the room that we have for further adjustments is further limited, just by virtue of the fact that we've eliminated so many other possibilities. These are just some detailed zoning parameters, just in terms of setbacks, building height. A lot of these numbers really should be recognizable to a lot of you if you pay attention to zoning. That 7,500 square foot minimum lot size is actually the prevailing or the existing minimum lot size in our current zoning for the C zone. The building heights, especially in the transit area triplex, 2.5 stories, 35 feet. That's the zoning today. So even though we're zoning for additional density, what we're not doing is zoning for physical buildings that are significantly different in size and shape from what is currently allowed under our existing zoning. And that's been a real goal of the planning board, of my department, of everyone that's been dealing with this, is to do our best to preserve the existing physical character of town while also achieving compliance with this zoning. It's really been kind of the North Star of this entire process. If we didn't care about that, it would be a lot easier. We could have had zoning done 3 months ago. But it's such a high priority in every planning process that we've ever done since I've been involved in planning in Milton, dating back to 2014 and even before that. The physical character of the town is a paramount thing for folks who have participated in those processes, and so we've taken that very seriously throughout this process. So the next steps, the select board has sent a zoning article to the planning board for its consideration. The way that state statute kind of talks about how zoning gets amended. The planning board typically initiates new zoning amendments, but other boards in town can do that. The select board can write a zoning article. The Board of Appeals can write a zoning article. 10 or 100 citizens can write a zoning article and get it on the warrant. So the process of getting an article onto the warrant, those wheels are moving. The planning board is reviewing this language. They've been, and the zoning language in large part is a lot of what we just showed you, is the zoning parameters. It's the different dimensional requirements. The state has developed a sample bylaw that they've encouraged towns to use. So it's not quite plug and play, but it almost is, where you take your kind of unique dimensional parameters, you put them into their sample, and you've got zoning that should pass muster with the state. Like I said, the planning board is currently reviewing this language. They may choose to edit it, they may choose to amend it, they may choose to develop their own zoning article, at which point the select board will have to decide whether it wants to continue moving forward with its own article or yield to the planning board. So that's a process that's still ongoing. At some point, either the select board will continue with its article and the planning board will hold a public hearing on it sometime before the special town meeting, or the planning board will develop its article and the select board may decide to withdraw its own. Either way, there's going to be a planning board public hearing on zoning prior to the special town meeting, which has been scheduled for December 4th of 2023. So, time flies. It's not summertime anymore. We are kind of rapidly approaching that special town meeting. So that's really the next big step. And then that meeting was scheduled early in December to get town meeting assembled, get a vote, and if that vote comes out positive, we can get that zoning to the state prior to the December 31st deadline, and hopefully be in compliance. So the next bit of technical assistance that we've been working on is a fiscal impact analysis of potential new zoning. The planning board commissioned RKG Associates, which is a very highly regarded firm that does this work all over the Commonwealth and all over the country, frankly, to conduct a fiscal impact analysis. And the purpose is provide the planning board with revenue and cost comparisons of different build-out scenarios for the districts that the planning board chooses. Calculate potential fiscal benefits of building MBTA community districts over time, understand where constraints may be placed on existing department capacity, and then help Milton plan for potential capacity needs going forward. What RKG does is they take our budget, they sort of evaluate all the different components that go into every departmental budget. I say every departmental budget, but the big ones are DPW, public safety, schools. These are the big drivers of the budget. These are the things that are affected by fluctuations in population. So they take all those inputs, they take our tax rate, they take our assessed values of all of our properties. They develop a model that, again, we're talking about these software models. You put the inputs in and the outputs come out as, what are the estimated municipal costs? What are the estimated municipal revenues? The model that we've asked RKG to build requires inputting sort of the specific sub-districts that we want to zone for. So we haven't quite determined those yet. So in the meantime, RKG has provided an interim analysis based on kind of their knowledge of our budget and all the things that they've been analyzing, and have kind of developed a per unit cost revenue algorithm that basically can provide a kind of a general outlook of here's the per unit cost, here's the per unit revenue. You can then extrapolate that to different development schemes. So it's a little bit of a word of caution, just because we commissioned RKG to do a very specific thing. They have not yet completed that very specific job, but we wanted this information just so we can start to understand what we're looking at. So this is a flow chart that's provided by RKG. I won't profess to understand exactly what goes into everything, but it's relatively straightforward. Municipal expenditures, the development program under the zoning, the assumptions about what the pace of change is going to be, where units are more likely to be built, demographic metrics, tax rates, incremental cost. Incremental costs are one thing to understand, and we're getting, I'm going to try not to get over my skis on this stuff, but one of the things that RKG takes into account is there are fixed costs and then there are variable costs in the town budget. We've got one town administrator, we've got one superintendent, we've got one police chief, we've got one fire chief. If we added 100 units, 1,000 units, the likelihood that we get a second town administrator or a second police chief are probably pretty slim. Hopefully we would pay those folks more, if they're dealing with that much more, population, but also that's considered to be a fixed cost. What's not a fixed cost is, as your population increases, you may need more teachers. You may need more police officers. You may need more fire trucks. And so RKG kind of draws the distinction between fixed costs and variable costs. And so each additional new household that comes into Milton in a new unit built under the zoning isn't really causing an increase in the fixed cost, because the fixed cost is fixed, but they are contributing to an increase in the variable costs. We'll have more explanation and information about that, when the full model is provided by RKG, but that's just one thing to kind of understand. And then the outputs are, net new tax receipts from property taxes, which is our main source of revenue, other fees and revenues, vehicle excise tax, CPA surcharge, and then minus the municipal costs. What is the each new unit's contribution, to those variable costs? And the final output is the net fiscal impact. And so, as I said, the full model that we've asked RKG to produce has not been produced yet, but they have produced this interim product that you can kind of very generally extrapolate and estimate what these fiscal impacts are for hypothetical development schemes. And what the next slide is going to show is certain hypothetical developments that could potentially be produced under this zoning, but are kind of more general and kind of speculative than the full kind of model. And so you've got four kind of potential development schemes here: a 50-unit market rate apartment building, a 100-unit market rate apartment building, a 100-unit mixed income affordable project with 90 market rate units, 10 affordable units, and then a townhouse development with 12 units. So not an apartment building, but an attached townhouse. So all of these numbers are based on our tax rate and our practices for assessing these types of projects. So while these are speculative projects and hypothetical projects, they are based in real town of Milton numbers. So you can see going across, you've got the use category, the development program. We'll just look at the top one by way of example: a 50-unit apartment building. The estimated assessed value is a shade over $10 million. That gets assessed at a tax rate of $11.40 per thousand of assessed value. That comes out to an estimated gross annual taxes of $116,138. The estimated municipal costs, and then again, those are driven by school costs, public safety, DPW, those variable costs that are part of that budget. That's broken out into estimated municipal and school, $49,000, $46,000. And that nets out to a net gain of $20,778. The model is complicated. I don't profess to know what's inside of it, but the outputs are simple. It's math. We collect $116,000 from this type of development. We kind of need to pay out a little less than $100,000 in municipal costs and school costs, and so that is a net gain, to the town of $20,778. Each of these other development programs, the 100-unit project, again, same scenario of, here's what the estimated gross taxes are, here's what the estimated costs are. We net out almost $54,000 in this scenario. Each of these development schemes, I hate to use the term runs a profit, but are net gains to the budget, in these cases. One thing that I'll say is, again, because we have asked RKG to do a model that kind of deals specifically with the subdistricts that we're talking about. These numbers may not necessarily play out exactly as they are now in these sort of hypothetical situations when you sort of put them into our very specific set of subdistricts and the very specific set of dimensional parameters. All that being said, the zoning that we're talking about has the potential to create these types of projects: 50 units, 100 units in some of the larger zoning districts. We're not zoning for townhouses, but I would estimate that a unit in a 3-family house may be similar to what is assessed here for the townhomes. But that's speculation on my part. We don't have to speculate too long. We'll have the full model soon enough. But I think these are very, very promising initial results. I think it was a huge concern of people that we're being compelled to zone for so many more units. What are we going to do with all this population? And I think what we're discovering, and this has played out in other municipalities, and plays out similarly in Milton for the multifamily housing that we have, is that multifamily housing is a net gain from a budgetary perspective, and so that's actually really, really great news. So one other bit of news that I think residents have been following with some interest is the idea of Milton's classification as a rapid transit community. There's a sentiment among certain residents, among certain elected and appointed board members that you look at the orange line or the blue line and you compare it to the Mattapan trolley, and these are obviously different things. So for Milton to be in a category that includes the city of Cambridge and the city of Somerville, and city of Revere, which has these rapid transit lines that are real subway lines. People are questioning that, and so the select board on August 10th sent a letter to the MBTA requesting an explanation for how they classify the Mattapan trolley as rapid transit under the T's service delivery policy. And so on September 8th, little less than a month ago, we received correspondence back from Lindsay Heffernan, who is the T's assistant general manager for policy and transit planning. And she said, and I'll read this, for everyone. In classifying transit modes, consideration by the MBTA is not given to destination, e.g., whether the mode includes service to downtown Boston, capacity, or service delivery levels. Rather, the designation is a technical one based on characteristics of the vehicle, such as whether it operates on a fixed guideway, uses a designated right-of-way, or uses a fixed catenary system. While quality and frequency of service are certainly an important part of the rider's experience and are areas in which the MBTA is seeking to improve, they are not material to the designation of the Mattapan line as light rail. And light rail there is used, in the context of the MBTA service delivery policy. Subway and light rail, red line, green line, red line, blue line, orange line is sort of subway, heavy rail. Green Line and Mattapan trolley are light rail. These are all considered to be rapid transit. The sort of the cognitive disconnect that I think may be out there is, this is called the MBTA Communities Act, but the MBTA didn't really have much to do at all with the development of this law or with the guidelines. Their name is used in reference to the fact that we're zoning around transit, but this is all kind of a product of the legislature and the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities. And so, in our conversations with HLC, what they've said to us is, we consulted with the T about how they categorize their service. We believe in transit-oriented development. We believe that, the best type of service that provides, the most connections to the most amenities, whether they're jobs, civic amenities, commercial amenities, is rapid transit. And that's how, we decided to sort of create the different obligations that different communities have. There are commuter rail communities that are responsible for fewer units of unit capacity. They also have a later deadline, but they consider Milton to be rapid transit. I think the notion was, if the T could provide some clarity about what they think rapid transit is, perhaps we would go to HLC and say, here's what the T says. The T is saying it's rapid transit. There's no doubt about it. In the meantime, the select board has recently sent an additional letter to the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, again, requesting clarity about their guidelines because there are some inconsistencies in how HLC refers to rapid transit, subway, red line in their definitions of their guidelines. And so, when we get that response from HLC, they've gotten our letter, they're formulating a response right now. We'll disseminate that to as many folks as we can. One thing we want to remind people of, though, irrespective of what the T thinks and kind of irrespective of the condition of the Mattapan trolley right now, one of the things that HLC has said to us is that, they're operating under the assumption that MBTA service will get better. This is a priority for everyone. Everyone wants the T to succeed. It's the only transit system we've got. If we want to do transit-oriented development, which you'll see in a future slide, is really critical to achieving our economic development, climate change, transportation goals. We don't have a choice but to treat the T as if it's going to be viable and improve service. That's HLC's kind of position. The Mattapan trolley runs every 6 minutes in the peak commuting time and every 12 minutes at other times of the day. That's the schedule. That schedule sometimes doesn't happen for various circumstances, but that is the intent of the Mattapan trolley, is to run at those headways, and they do with some frequency. That's the regular schedule. The Mattapan trolley will get you downtown faster than picking up the Green Line at Riverside, which is unequivocally a rapid transit station. It'll get you to downtown faster than picking up the Green Line at Boston College. It'll get you downtown faster than picking up the Red Line at Braintree. Now, that's a function of slow zones, which are going to be hopefully fixed soon. But the fact remains that the Mattapan trolley is competitive with these other forms of rapid transit in the system that are, comparable distances from the downtown core. The Mattapan line transformation project is underway. The T is expecting to have a design for that project by the end of the year. They've put an enormous amount of investment, $127 million, into the design of this project that's going to improve the tracks, improve the stations, and eventually improve the rolling stock so that it is more equivalent to a Green Line light rail system. So again, that's a priority for the T. That should be a priority for Milton. You may have heard we announced it. I think we announced it at our last meeting, if not at other meetings. But there is going to be an impending shutdown of the Ashmont and Mattapan lines. This is similar to the shutdown of the Orange Line last year, where in order to sort of plow through as much track work as the T possibly can, they're going to shut those lines down. It's a tremendous inconvenience. It's a pain. I wish it wasn't happening. I wish the T had been able to maintain their tracks, in a state of good repair over the course of years. But the fact remains that there's going to be a significant amount of work done on these tracks in a relatively short amount of time. And recent comments by the general manager of the T at the last board of directors meeting, indicates that the expectation is that Red Line commute times are going to be 33 minutes faster as a result of these improvements. And just on the Mattapan line, a 5-minute improvement in service on the Mattapan line, which, when you consider how short the Mattapan line is, 5 minutes is not a joke. That's speedy. And so that's not even taking into account the broader transformation project. This is just, it'll be disruptive. It'll be a pain. There's going to be a shutdown. But the T is anticipating the results of those shutdowns to be immediate improvements in Mattapan line service. So the final thing that I want to underscore, because I think there's been a lot of discourse about this, in the community. I've seen materials that are out there. I've seen discussions that people have been having about, we think of environmental friendliness, and we think of green, we think of open space, we think of trees. Not necessarily, you don't necessarily think of apartment buildings and development. But MBTA communities is good climate policy. Period. End of sentence. Transit-oriented development is the number one thing that any municipality can do under its own control to affect climate policy and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And we just want to remind people that in the United States, the number one contributor to greenhouse gas emissions is transportation. And a significant portion of those emissions come from personal vehicles. And if you want to reduce emissions, if you want to affect climate policy, you need to reduce vehicle miles traveled. And putting people in a position to do their business, not having to get in their car to go to the store, not having to get in the car to drive kids to school, not having to get in the car to drive to work, is the number one thing that we have under our control to affect climate change and to, reverse the course of this, catastrophe that we're on. This map on the right side of the screen is a recent project that the New York Times did that basically shows a household average of carbon emissions. And blue is good, and orange is bad. Ranging from 20 tons of CO2 per household on the left end to more than 70 tons of CO2 per household on the right end. And I think what you can see is, you know, city of Boston, Cambridge, you know, portions of Brookline, Quincy, you know, places that are densely developed, places that have access to transit, places where there is multifamily housing. These are the places that have the lowest household carbon emissions. And in the places where that's not so much, you know, out in Newton, down in Westwood, in the town of Milton, which you can see on the map is sort of light and getting to dark orange. These are places where housing density is much less, where the density of commercial and civic amenities is much less. And people don't have much of a choice but to get in their car to go where they're going to go and do what they're going to do. And that means that your household carbon emissions are going to be higher than if you lived in a walkable neighborhood, if you lived in a building where, you know, this is a kind of underrated factor in kind of multifamily housing. But when you put units next to each other and on top of each other, there's an insulating property there, and your energy bills are lower, and the amount of energy that you use is lower because everyone's taking advantage of being in such close proximity. That goes out the window when you're heating an enormous single family house. You know, so, you know, this slide, and hopefully you've had a chance to read this slide. I'm not going to read all these things, but the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Sierra Club, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, everyone is pointing in this direction. One of the most significant portions and purposes of this law, in addition to helping to mitigate and reverse our housing crisis, is to, again, take control of one of the things that we have control over, which is land use, and point it in a direction of a more responsible development pattern as it relates to climate. So that's the end of the presentation. I went a little bit over an hour, so I apologize. I was trying to hit less than an hour, but we're going to open up the question and comment period. Again, apologies. The Q&A is not enabled right now. So if you do have a question, please raise your hand, and you know, you'll be entered into that queue, and we'll get to folks as they raise their hands. So you shouldn't be able to see my screen anymore. And so, Josh, if you want to run the
We have Matt Lagon with his hand raised first. Matt, you can speak and ask your question.
Hello, thanks for taking the question. I was just wondering what the value of those grants that we would forego by not being in compliance is, the total value of those 3 grants, and then what is the total budget of the town?
So the value of the grants, and this is something you know, that we've kind of discussed you know, quite a bit, and it's the truth of the matter is we don't get a ton of value out of those grant programs. The Housing Choice Initiative grant is basically kind of an incentive program to kind of act as a carrot to incentivize towns to do more housing production. Some towns have taken advantage of it, have gotten, you know, significant gains in state grant money. We would not be eligible for that grant in the first place because we just not have kept up with housing production. The Local Capital Projects Fund, up until this recent budget, which was just recently passed by the legislature, was actually a significant one in the sense that it is it's different from the other ones because it's not competitive, it's not application based. It's basically Local Capital Projects Funds comes out of casino revenues, and it's basically just a sort of a little goodie bag that the state has. And what they've done typically for the last 10 years has been to supplement their subsidies to local housing authorities via the Local Capital Projects Fund. And so now I forget the exact number, so I don't want to speculate on it, but a certain proportion of all of the money that the Milton Housing Authority gets from the state comes from the Local Capital Projects Fund. And so what you had when this law was written was basically a situation where if you are not compliant, then the Milton Housing Authority, and when I say you, I mean the town, the Milton Housing Authority loses up to $35,000 a year in state subsidy because we would no longer be eligible for funds from the Local Capital Projects Fund. A lot of folks thought that was unfair. They thought it was sort of inconsistent. You're trying to sort of solve the housing crisis, but you're also taking money out of housing authorities' hands. And so the most recent budget that was passed has a little bit of a wrinkle in the appropriation for the local capital projects fund that basically says, effectively, we're not going to take MBTA communities compliance into account. Everyone gets their money. It is what it is. So the teeth on that one have been removed significantly. And then the last one is MassWorks. MassWorks is every year between $65 and $95 million a year that the state gives out in infrastructure grants. And these are infrastructure grants that are supposed to be tied to economic development. So, you want to, build a new civic center downtown, and you need to, install new sewer pipes to accommodate it. You can get a MassWorks grant, and they'll give you, $1 million, $2 million to put in new sewer pipes down Main Street to sort of facilitate economic development. It's serious money for towns that are players in that game. Milton has not typically been a player in the MassWorks game. We did get a $1 million grant maybe 11 or 12 years ago, which was used to improve Elliott Street between Central Ave and Milton Village. So all of the nice sidewalks, all of the nice brick pavers, all the nice street lamps, we used a MassWorks grant to pay for that. Your question about the overall town budget, I don't know if Josh has been furiously typing to look up the last town report about what the budget is, but it's I don't have that at my fingertips, but it's obviously it's up there.
Okay, so
it's about
thank you.
50 million per municipal expenses, and the same for school budget. But
So around more than $100 million.
100 million. Okay, so we got 35,000, and our budget's 100 million.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
No, thanks for the question, Matt. And I want to make sure that we still all understand that the statute lays out these specific grant programs, but there are other potential consequences. So we're not just talking about $35,000. We're not just talking about maybe we get $1 million every 10 years for infrastructure projects. We're talking about a lawsuit from the Attorney General of the Commonwealth, which we should not feel confident about winning something like that on fair housing grounds.
There are also 13 additional grants that we've taken advantage of that were added in the August update, including all the grants that we would use to do sort of climate action through the MVP program would be at risk.
Joan Gankarski. Josh, if you want to promote Joan. Joan, go ahead.
In the meantime, should we can allow Bob Hiss to speak? Bob, you just have to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
First point, thank you to Tim and Josh. I want to make sure some participants know tonight that there are some towns in the Commonwealth that are subject to this that have, I believe, 30 members of the planning board or the planning department, and we have 2. So you guys are doing yeoman's duty to comply with this significant regulation from the state. So I have about 5 or 6 questions. Would you like them all at once or one at a time? Because I'm trying to anticipate what town meeting members will ask.
Let's go one.
I'll write them down.
Okay. The first one is if we have to comply with 50 acres and 15 units per, that's 750 units. Could you reconcile the 750 minimum of that math with 2461 in the regulation?
I can't reconcile it, but the way that the state housing agency, the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, has, because one of the things in the statute says that your district has to be a reasonable size. So the statute doesn't say 50 acres. The statute doesn't have a unit requirement. It says reasonable size, 15 units per acre. And the way that HLC has interpreted that via their guidelines is both a physical dimension, which is 50 acres, at least, and then a kind of unit dimension, that reasonable size means not just the sort of physical size of the land, but what can that land accommodate? And so that unit capacity number is a function of HLC's interpretation of the statute's requirement that a zoning district has to be a reasonable size. They're basically saying, reasonable is, a certain number of units based on, and that 2461 itself is kind of a function of any given municipality's year-round housing number. So rapid transit communities, again, because they interpret that as being the best amount of service, they have the highest obligation, responsible for 25% of your year-round housing count. Commuter rail communities will be responsible for less. I think it's 10%. And then there are other communities that have a lower obligation itself. So it's a great question, because again, it's simple math that you can do, and then it gets turned into a really sort of complicated kind of consideration of what do we mean by reasonable size. And so for better or for worse, that's what the guidelines say, and that's how they interpret that.
Thank you. So two extremes in my business, we test algorithms like RKG at the extreme. So let's say that a well-heeled developer comes backed by BlackRock, and they've got hundreds of billions of dollars under assets. And they say, Milton is going to be the premier retirement community of Boston. And I'm going to put multi-million-dollar units, multifamily units in this with all the high-end amenities. And we only end up with 750 units. Are we in compliance?
Yes. Great question. Terrible sounding scenario, but behind it is a good question. And it kind of underscores something that we say a lot and may not be 100% clear to people, that the law is a mandate to create zoning, which is, so the law is focused on municipalities. Municipalities have the ability to write bylaws and set their own regulations. And so they're saying, you've got to create a bylaw that does X, Y, and Z. If we were to create zoning that the state deemed to be compliant and a single unit was not produced ever, we would remain in compliance. That's probably not likely to happen. Someone will build something, but the sort of the thing that HLC and the state are really concerned with is that the zoning does what the law asks it to do, and then basically we trust the sort of the real estate market to kind of do its thing and create the housing for us. So if BlackRock comes in and builds 750 units under our compliant zoning, we were compliant before BlackRock came to town, we're compliant after BlackRock comes to town, we're all set.
Understood. Thank you. At the other extreme, let's say developers came in and developed units that put 3 children in 2461 units. We'd end up with 7,500 kids. And again, maybe not realistic, but just testing the extremes of the algorithm. Town meeting just approved changing some zoning to accommodate, I think, about 500 kids above the school limit. Yeah, the algorithm says we could be facing 7,500. Are they looking at these extremes as well?
So no, for multiple reasons. And I'll kind of go through them and just so folks know, we did say 3 minutes. I'm going to give a little bit of latitude to the moderator, because he's going to have to deal with all this stuff. So you just want to sort of let people know, these are good questions, and we want to make sure we give the opportunity to get answers to them. So the 2461 number, it derives from this concept of unit capacity, and basically what it does is it says whatever is in your town right now, whatever's on every parcel, ignore it and pretend it's a blank parcel. And if your zoning says that you can build 3 units on one parcel, that parcel has a unit capacity of 3 units. Right? Just like today, you can build one single family house on a 7,500 square foot lot in the C zone. That lot has a unit capacity of 1. As a practical matter, because we are zoning in areas that have not just existing single family houses, but existing multifamily projects. The net number of new units, even if every single parcel in every single zoning district got redeveloped, which it won't for reasons I'll explain in a minute, we would still not see 2461 units, because if you take a house on Elliott Street and you develop it into 3 units, you're only netting 2 units. So 1 unit worth of all of those municipal impacts has already been baked in. Cold comfort, because it's still a lot of potential net new units, but we're already now seeing a significant decrease below 2461 new households. The other thing you have to understand about the way zoning works, and I try to say this all the time because I think it's fascinating. When we've gone back and looked at sort of the discourse in town in 1938 around the zoning code that was developed that we still more or less live with today. And one of the things that the folks that developed that zoning code said was, once we create this new zoning, C zone, 7,500 square feet, A zone, B zone, business districts, we have the potential for there to be 60,000 Miltonians. So our current zoning, and it's changed over the years, obviously, mostly to be decreased. But at the time, they were saying, like, we can go from, 15,000 or whatever Miltonians to 60,000 Miltonians. Obviously, we never got there, but it's important to understand that this concept of kind of unit capacity is, it's academic more than it is practical, because what you're talking about when you talk about zoning is individual property owners making an individual decision to redevelop their property. And so when you have, I'll give an example. 36 Elliott Street, which is the old Milton Hill House. It's a relatively old apartment building, as apartment buildings go. The site plan is not contemporary. Big, huge parking lot, doesn't make efficient use of the site. That is a site that I think there's a reasonable expectation that in the near to medium term, if that's rezoned for additional density, that property owner may consider redeveloping. And that'll be a situation where there's currently, I think, 38 units in that building. Say you can build 50 units, on that site. We're netting, what's the difference? 12 or I'm not a math guy. But the other thing to consider is we're also rezoning the building next door, 50 Elliott Street, which is not even, if it's 10 years old, it's exactly 10 years old. The odds of that property being redeveloped anytime soon are very remote. Same thing for 88 Wharf Street, which is a 78 unit building. And, all of those condo owners are not going to agree to knock down their own homes and redevelop into a new building. It's just not going to happen. So because it's a zoning mandate, not a production mandate, all we're required to do is create that zoning that could potentially yield those units. But the actual practical likelihood of all of these units being developed ever, or even within a sort of reasonable kind of short to medium term time frame, is slim. So there will be some redevelopment. 100%. I'm not going to say that there's not, but I think the way that we're drawing up these sub-districts is trying to do it in a way where that redevelopment is gradual and as organic as possible, so that you're not seeing these sudden impacts, of all of these units at the same time. The last thing that I'll say, and if you want to go on the resources page on the MBTA community site, you can look at RKG's full presentation, and they have a set of metrics around school children that they use, and that's based on observations here in Milton, observations based on census data, observations from other communities that they've worked in, that basically says, here's the factor of, a 1-bedroom apartment yields this many school-age children, a 2-unit apartment yields this many, a 3-unit, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, single family house, condo building, rental building. And what we found, again, both in Milton and across the region, is that households or housing units that generate school-age children is driven primarily by bedroom count. And it's driven, relatedly by the style of housing. And so a single family house has the potential to generate the most school children. The bigger you get in terms of building, even from single family detached to single family attached, to townhouse, to garden style apartment, to 50-unit apartment building, the number of units goes like this, the number of school-age children goes like this. there are no school-age children in 36 Central. There are 3 at 50 Elliott Street. So what we find, again, here in town and in the census data, is that these types of multifamily developments are not generating school-age children. So there's no way to guarantee that there's not going to be kids. People live where they're going to live, and it's our obligation to educate children. But I think when you look at our current zoning and what our current zoning produces, which is single-family houses on big house lots, there are 17 school-age children going to Milton Public Schools from Woodlot Drive, which is a 23-house subdivision. Again, compare that to 78 or to 88 Wharf Street, which has 0. So our current development pattern and our current zoning is doing a lot more to bring school-age children into town than multifamily zoning would do. But again, I don't want to go too far down this track because our obligation is to educate children that live in the town of Milton. So I think we can kind of project and estimate, but ultimately, I mean, to your point, we will have to, accommodate these kids, in facilities if they come and live here.
So Tim and Josh, just speaking as a taxpayer, thank you for not only doing your full-time jobs during the daylight hours at Town Hall, but sitting here from 7 to 8:30 or maybe 9 o'clock tonight on your personal time, working to educate the citizens and the town meeting members on the impact of this legislation. So I appreciate it. Well done.
And thank you for your good questions, Mr. Moderator. Thank you.
Robert Rozovsky has his hand up next. Rob.
Thank you. Good evening. First, without him having mentioned it, I did want to echo what Bob Hiss just said, and thank you both to Tim and Josh for the enormous amount of time. It's obvious that you've been putting in. I don't know how many planning department people work in other municipalities. So my question relates to sort of the number of new units we might expect. I understand there's a metric that generates to 2461, but given particularly in the rapid transit district along Elliott Street, where I live, I would assume we would expect fewer than 2461 new units to be developed as a result of this zoning. I don't know what that number would be. I understand it would also depend on how the districts get configured, some fine points in the zoning article, the districts outside the rapid transit corridor. But could you just speak to whether we should expect fewer than 2461 new units?
Yeah, I mean, I think I addressed a lot of this in my previous response, but just to kind of specifically kind of talk about the transit area. So the way that, and again, we haven't settled on an exact sub-district boundary. We haven't settled on exact, dimensional parameters, but the transit area triplex district, all of the parcels in that district currently have a potential unit capacity of 480 units. So if you think about that blue area, if every single one of the eligible parcels that are 7,500 square feet or more got redeveloped, that would be 480 units. The triplex area, the transit area with all of those kind of small house lots is the toughest one to predict. You can look at a big parcel and, like I use the example of 36 Elliott Street. That might get redeveloped in the next decade. With the transit area triplex, you've got hundreds of parcels with hundreds of different property owners. Who knows what they're going to decide? But the benefit of that district is every change that each individual property owner makes is relatively small given the size of the district. So the unit capacity is 480. We will not see 480 units in the transit area triplex anytime soon, if ever. Again, just because not everyone wants to redevelop. Some people like to have a single family house and they want to keep it.
Yeah. Could I just do a follow-up?
Sure.
So yeah, I mean, I asked my question only because particularly within the triplex, there are already existing units, whether those are single family homes or not. So I assume if, a single family owner redevelops and there are 3 units, it's really a net increase of only 2. And so for the 2461, I would think we should expect to see fewer than 2461 new units.
Yes, I think that's a fine assumption to make.
Okay. All right. Thanks very much.
We have Tracy Dyke Redmond. Tracy, you can unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Well, first, I want to say thank you so much for an excellent, very informative presentation. It's just very clear, and I appreciate it. And I appreciate also your pointing out the importance of this work for climate change. That's really important too. And my question is on that point. If the zoning were to pass and this becomes the policy of the town, I'm wondering what the plans are, what the process would be for ensuring that these new zoning areas that have multifamily housing, what can we do to make sure that there are opportunities for transportation that isn't driving? And I'm thinking about East Milton Square, and I'm thinking about the Granite Street area, which aren't currently connected to the T. Like, what can we do to make walking, biking, et cetera, better options there? And what would the process for that be? Thank you.
So it's a great question. On the actual zoning end, it's a little bit tough because, one of the wrinkles of by right zoning is there's no discretionary review process. So if you put a lot of really kind of intricate bespoke requirements into your zoning, you've got to have someone to kind of evaluate whether or not a proposal has met those requirements. Typically, that's the planning board in the issuance of a special permit. With by right zoning, it's really got to be something where the building inspector can look at the application, check all the boxes, and give you your permit. And so the other thing about HLC's requirements is you can't put a zoning requirement into your MBTA community zoning that isn't required of other projects in other zoning districts. And I think the kind of the great example that they use, which is not relevant to your question, but relevant, I think, to the issues that you sound to be concerned about, is, we can't put additional kind of green building requirements on MBTA communities zoning because we don't have that type of thing on a single family house on Pleasant Street. And so from the zoning angle, we're a little bit limited in what we can do to kind of point people in that direction. But again, one of the primary points of land use regulation is you put the houses where there's transit, where there's amenities, where there's pedestrian access to stuff. People have demonstrated in this current real estate market an intense desire to live in these types of walkable communities. It's the reason why, people want to live downtown. People want to live in JP. People want to live in Cambridge. The housing prices in these communities indicate an intense demand to live in these types of places. And so, if you build it, they'll come. And so the development type itself, in a way, self-selects for the type of folks that are going to want to live that lifestyle. But you can't guarantee that. One of the things that you can guarantee is that you're not over parking these developments. One of the things that we understand about, transportation and land use development is you're not going to drive your car somewhere if there's nowhere to put it. Okay. And a lot of folks, decide to take public transit, downtown because they don't want to pay $80 at the aquarium garage. And if you try to get a spot on the street on a weekend, you're out of luck. If that aquarium garage wasn't there, you'd have many more people, taking the T or the bus or doing whatever to get to the aquarium, to use an example. And so one of the ways that manifests itself in residential development is, if you think about home as your destination, it's the ultimate destination at the end of the day. If there's nowhere to put your car, you're not going to bring a car to your home. And that affects your choice of where to live. And so we are setting a zoning requirement of really only one parking space as a minimum. What we found is developers of all people want to make the least amount of parking in their project as they possibly can. Parking is not an income generating use, and in real estate development, space is everything. And so if you were required by a town to build 1.5, 2, 1 space per bedroom in your project, that's not income generating land. That's not income generating development. And so when you set that minimum parking requirement at a low level, we anticipate seeing that level of parking. And so if you've got a household where, two people live together and they've only got one parking space, now you're in a situation where, maybe they don't have a car at all. Or maybe one person has a car and the other person works from home or takes the T or, does whatever. I live in a one-car household. I ride my bike to work and my wife has the car. People live like this. And if you build stuff where there's a ton of parking, that development is going to select for people that have a bunch of cars. And so, in the world of the zoning, that's what we can do. In the broader policy world, we're always interested in, improving the quality of our streets and improving the quality of our infrastructure. And what I'll say is, we haven't been big players in the MassWorks game, but we should be. And we should be taking advantage of these state resources to improve the sidewalks on Adam Street, for instance, so that people can walk around. I think development in these neighborhoods itself creates a better pedestrian environment. So it kind of is a virtuous cycle of the neighborhood gets more walkable as it gets kind of more developed, with new kind of pedestrian friendly amenities. So there's a bunch of other answers to this question, but I don't want to take too much time. So thank you for that one, Tracy. And hopefully that was helpful.
I'll also add that since 2011, Milton has been a stretch code community. So all these new developments have to comply with more stringent energy codes. And so any new development will be far more energy efficient than a house built in the 1920s, as is the case in sort of a lot of the transit area triplex zone. We have Kathy Green. Kathy, if you could unmute yourself.
There you go. Hey, Kathy.
Oh, hello there. Thank you very much for the presentation. And I'm new to this entire fact pattern, but I did do my homework this afternoon. And one caveat I would have for people like myself, and there may be a lot of them, is that during your presentation, you stop from time to time so people can digest this vast amount of material that you're giving us. And our presentation to most of us is a lot, and unless you get your yellow pad and you're taking notes. So every so often, just say, does anybody have any questions? And take a couple, because oftentimes like that fellow who had the 2 or 3 questions, those are very enlightening and were helpful. And I think most of the questions were. My perception of this, and maybe it's simplistic, but essentially we must create zones in compliance with this new state law. And if we do, we're okay. It doesn't mean that those zoning requirements are ever going to be implemented. Is this right?
Yes, and let me just address your first comment. Very well taken. I do appreciate that.
I'm sorry I had to.
No.
I think it's essential.
No, I hear you loud and clear. One thing I will say is this recording will be posted on our website. The presentation will be posted on our website. So if you missed anything, you can always go back. But I do appreciate that comment. And we'll conduct ourselves a little bit differently.
I did review your website presentations.
I definitely appreciate that one. So don't no harm, no foul on that. I get it. So you're broadly correct. The one thing that I'll say is that our conversations with the state and eventually the way this process is going to work is, if town meeting passes zoning, we're going to put a package together that includes the approved zoning language and the map that town meeting approves of these zoning districts. We're going to give it to the state, and the state is going to put it, just like we've been using the compliance model to test these districts, they're going to use this compliance model to do the ultimate test is, thumbs up or thumbs down on this zoning. And I think one thing that they're going to think about is this zoning credible, for lack of a better term?
I think that's a good term, because 2461 in a town that's so tightly zoned and over congested is sort of an absurd number.
It's a big number. But again, it's a function of our existing housing stock, and I think it's a function of I think what the law is saying is, I'm not going to go down that route.
Okay.
But what I will say is this, is that I'm trying to think of an example of like what we could potentially do that maybe the state would look at and be like, this is no good. So if we were to zone, Wollaston Golf Course, for townhouse developments, at some density or other, they may look at that and say like, yes, this technically meets the guidelines, but also, golf course is never going to become townhouses. And so you're getting credit for all these units that are never going to, what the state is really interested in is, not kind of phantom zoning that like works on paper, but that is not actually going to produce units. And there's an art to it. And this is kind of very speculative on my part, but again, just based on conversations I've had with other planners, with the state, the model is very numbers, and you could come up with zoning that spits out the right numbers, but you're ultimately having a state level bureaucrat looking at this saying like, our mission and the mission of this legislation is to produce housing, and we've got a bunch of zoning that's never going to yield any housing anywhere. So to answer your question, and someone else had a question earlier about this, if we pass compliant zoning and the state gives it the thumbs up, it doesn't matter if a single unit is produced. We're still good. I suspect that some units will be built, but that unit capacity, that 2461 number is kind of, again, like I said, more academic than it is a practical planning number, because we will absolutely not see 2461 new units.
Now you must understand that a citizen like myself, I'm somewhat aged, I read the paper and I see 2461. There isn't a little paren saying, don't get uptight. This really is wink, wink. It's never going to happen. So I think this is something that we as an ordinary people need to know, so you don't become alarmist over it.
No, I understand completely, and it's been.
So I listen. I won't go on, with this type of a, sort of attack zone that I'm in, but I can't help myself. I needed to get some of this out, and I consider myself Joe Average, and I'd like to think that there are many other Joe Averages out there who want to understand what's going on around them.
Definitely. And sir, I wish all of my attackers were as pleasant as you've been. So no worries there. So thank you for your questions, and hopefully, we provide some information that will kind of take a little bit of the edge off of things. So thank you for coming, and thank you for your questions.
You're welcome. Have a nice evening.
Katie?
We have Katie.
Oh, hi. I'm a little confused. I wonder if you could give me some clarity around the trolley being considered rapid transit. I was on a meeting with the select board meeting, and I thought I heard Mike Zullis mention that it wasn't defined as rapid transit. So I'm a little confused about that. And if that's the case, why wouldn't we try to get reclassified so we could lower that 2461 number to, I think it's like 900?
So what I think you're referring to, and I referenced it briefly. I don't have the letter at my fingertips, so I didn't want to get too deeply into it. The select board recently sent a letter to the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities. And if we don't already have that on our website, we'll have it there in the morning. Josh, let's just make a note to get that posted. And basically what the conversation that you're referring to is basically a kind of an inconsistency between what the HLC guidelines call rapid transit communities. And they say, Milton, Chelsea, Everett, Cambridge, Somerville, Medford, there's a couple others, are rapid transit communities. And rapid transit is defined as, it's basically, again, you can check it in the morning. I promise it'll be up. But basically the connection between Mattapan trolley, subway, rapid transit is not there in the state's guidelines. The letter that the select board sent was more kind of asking for clarity than kind of demanding change. But basically just trying to understand, like, look, we want to make sure that we're all clear, based on what we understand your guidelines to say, doesn't really actually say what your guidelines say. So we haven't heard back from HLC on that. If you're asking kind of, what I think, I don't know if I what I think. Our conversations with HLC on this particular issue and statements that they've made generally about MBTA community zoning, I think the likelihood of HLC saying, actually, we don't think Milton's rapid transit are very slim. They have told us that they depend on the MBTA's definition of how they classify their own transit service, which is why we went to MBTA in the first place to say, look, we think, that these are the characteristics of rapid transit. It doesn't really look like the Mattapan trolley fits that bill. What are your characteristics of rapid transit? Which were in that slide earlier. Just it's not based on one trip, or 1 seat or 2 seat or 3 seat ride to downtown. It's not based on how frequently it comes. It's literally based on the train tracks, the exclusive right of way. The power. It's technical kind of definitions that may not fit people's practical experience of the trolley, but that's how the T does it. So you've got this kind of indirect process where HLC is depending on the T is defining things based on things that maybe are not quite the same priorities as HLC has. And so that's kind of where you get this confusion of people look at these ancient trains and be like, this isn't, the orange line, zooming down the tracks out of Forest Hills. This is, the trolley, but it's considered to be rapid transit. But again, as a practical matter, like I said, the headways are every 6 minutes in the peak hour, and the investments that the T has planned are commensurate with good transit service that'll get you downtown in a reasonable time.
Okay, well, it's just a little bit confusing because I thought I heard him say that according to whatever it was that he was reading, that it wasn't considered a rapid transit. So I guess there's just a little confusion around that.
Yeah, I mean, again, not having watched that meeting, but having, participated in discussions about, that correspondence, I think, the chair was kind of expressing an opinion based on his read of the guidelines. And that's something that the select board put into a letter, and we'll hopefully get some clarity from HLC in the very near future on that issue.
Yeah, because that would make a big difference in the number of units that we need to plan for.
Yeah, understood. I don't think it's likely that HLC will make a change in their guidelines, based on that. I think the what's more likely to happen is they'll just change the guidelines to say the Mattapan trolley is rapid transit, period, end of sentence. But it's a worthwhile question to ask, and it's good to sort of get that clarity to make sure that they understand that we see an inconsistency in their guidelines, and how are we going to rectify that?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the question.
All right, we have Jill Clark next, and I think since we're running close to 9, if you intend to speak, if you could raise your hand, and then we'll sort of not accept new hand raises after the next few moments.
Thank you. I want to add to the chorus of people thanking you both for the incredible work that you've put into this. And I haven't been able to attend all of the meetings, but I've attended enough that it's been really interesting to see the sort of evolution of your thinking on this over time. And there have been lots of different solutions, and it's sort of narrowed and narrowed. And what you've presented here today seems that, if I'm understanding correctly, that there is a solution that you think kind of works the best, which is what you'll be approaching the planning board with. So my question is, what happens if the planning board doesn't like it? And I'm asking that question both in terms of is there a plan B scenario? And also if the planning board does come back with significant revisions or rejects it outright, how does that impact the timeline of getting to town meeting in December and meeting the state's deadlines down the road?
So thank you, Jill. I appreciate everyone's kind words. We're here to do this job. I'm glad people think we're doing a good job, but I'm fine with this being a thankless job. It's fine. Josh is not fine with it being thankless.
I'm grateful for the thanks. Thanks, y'all.
Yeah, I am also grateful. I appreciate it. So it's a good question, and let me just say from the outset that I think everyone's goal here, and I sincerely believe this, everyone involved in this process is working in good faith towards the closest thing to a consensus solution to this zoning as possible. I think there's been some disagreements within various boards, between various boards about what the best approach to all of this is. I think everyone is working towards the same goal, which is good, because if they weren't, we'd be in big trouble. But everyone is, so that's good. We've got that going for us. The select board's priority in all of this, in my understanding, has been to get compliant zoning in the hands of town meeting in enough time to reach our compliance deadline of December 31st. The select board is not a land use planning body, but they do have the power under Chapter 40A, the Section 5 that deals with amendment and creation of zoning articles. They do have the power to initiate a zoning article. And so in order to make sure that those procedural wheels are spinning when they need to spin, the select board submitted an article to the planning board with enough time for the planning board to have a public hearing and make its recommendation to town meeting in advance of December 4th. So if nothing else happens, the planning board will have a public hearing about the select board's article. It'll go through review by the warrant committee. The warrant committee will make its recommendation that gets printed on the warrant. We're at town meeting on December 4th, irrespective of anything. I think the goal here is to get this stuff in the hands of the folks that have been elected to do this, which is the planning board. The planning board has been working, it's like crazy. I mean, you go to these meetings and they've been around that table, pouring through this stuff, significant amounts of time, going through these different iterations. Not at the point where they've got zoning language drawn up yet. But I think the select board's goal has always been, let's just get the process moving, get this stuff into the hands of the people who we trust and elect to write this zoning. And so, the planning board is in the process of doing that. Whether they decide to, put their mark on the select board's article and make changes or amendments, whether they decide that they want to, start closer to scratch with their own article, some combination of the two. They're still in those kind of discussions, but I think at the very least, there is an article out there. There is going to be a public hearing on a zoning article, and a zoning article is going to get to town meeting. That's kind of, again, the wheels that the select board set in motion there. Whose article it is, whether the planning board picks it up and takes it as their own, whether it's still the select board's article, the coming weeks, will determine that. But, we are on track to get to town meeting. And then that's always been it. No matter what Josh and I do in terms of kind of assisting the planning board and the select board with the stuff, no matter what recommendation the planning board makes or the warrant committee makes, it's going to be up to town meeting members. And that's, that's all we can do is get it into the hands of our legislature. That's it.
Thanks, Jill. We have Joe, one of many Joes in the line.
So there's another there's another Joe, and then there's a last Joe after Douglas. And that Joe after Douglas is going to be the last, because we're coming up on time. But you, right, Joe, right now are speaking.
Are unmuted. Thank you very much. So I want to make sure I understand something. Okay, so I'm going to use moderator Hiss's example about BlackRock for a second. In the triplex district, all the 7,500 square foot properties, if they were purchased by BlackRock and they developed them to triple deckers, 3 units, would that area qualify as in this ordinance?
So the process that you've described is putting the cart before the horse. The thing that gets us to compliance is not any property owner redeveloping or any person buying property. It's creating the zoning that allows for a certain type of redevelopment. So BlackRock doesn't
Just
Billy,
if a
the village
property
is-
owner redeveloped, I'll do it different. If all of the property owners in the triplex area wanted to remove their houses and build three deckers, would every single one of those count towards this number, even though you will never get to the total density that we're allowed?
So they wouldn't be able to do that until or unless we amend the zoning. Because the zoning right now in that district is single family zoning. So if you've got one house on one lot, and in fact, most of that area is actually non-compliant because the zoning is for 7,500 minimum lot size. Most of those lots are between 5,000 and 6,000 square feet. So you couldn't even build the houses that are there, let alone more than one house. So the order of operations is the town passes new zoning, and then it's up to the individual property owners to do what they want to do, not the other way around where all the property owners or any given property owner does something, because you can't build a 3-family house in that area right now. The zoning doesn't allow it.
But the triplex would allow you to do that. The new zoning we're talking about would allow you to do that.
Right.
And that's what we're talking. I'm not talking about existing zoning. I don't care about the existing zoning. It's the new zoning in particular would allow me to do that.
Right. Correct.
And if everybody in that district did that, we wouldn't get to the density that you're speaking about within that district.
So if every single parcel owner decided to redevelop to the full extent of the zoning, there would potentially be, 480 units of unit capacity in that district. So that means that, if you, and this goes back to sort of that concept of how they consider unit capacity, if you treat every one of those parcels as a blank slate, you could build 480 units on that collection of parcels. Now, most of those parcels already have one house on them already. So the new units would be less than 480 in that particular sub-district. But again, the likelihood of all of those property owners moving in the same direction at the same time is infinitesimally small. Because again,
we've been running a public survey and asked that question directly, whether you would sell or redevelop your property if it was rezoned, and an overwhelming majority, well over 75% of respondents did not indicate that they would redevelop or sell their property for redevelopment. So the likelihood from Miltonians seems very low.
Yeah, I understand that. And can I ask if the compliance model takes into consideration assembly of properties?
No. And that becomes up to us, right? So one of the things, if we were to not set a minimum lot size, then you could sort of, take those two 5,000 square foot parcels and kind of put them together, or get 3 of them and put them together and build, whatever. There's a way that you can do the zoning, and we've tested this for in other circumstances. We've kind of not gone in that direction, where there's sort of like a sliding scale of units to sort of area. So like for every 5,000 square foot of area you get a new unit. So depending on the size of the parcel, you get more units. That's not how we're doing the zoning here. Every parcel, you can only build up to 3 units, and the minimum lot size is 7,500 square feet. And so there are, I think under the current borders of the district, 47% of the parcels in that sub-district are 7,500 square feet or greater. So the way that we've drawn up the zoning right now, most of the parcels in that area could not be redeveloped. And so the compliance model isn't taking into account assembling parcels. But even if someone did assemble parcels, so if you owned a 5,000 square foot lot, you bought your neighbor's 5,000 square foot lot, you could still only build 3 units on that 10,000 square foot lot. You would need to get up to, 15,000 square feet before you could get 6 units at that point.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yep, absolutely.
Thanks, Joe. We have Joe Junior. You can unmute yourself.
Thank you. I just unmuted, I think.
Yep,
we can hear you.
I just have 2 quick questions, I hope. I know you must be exhausted. Could you just reiterate or clarify for me, I'm sure you've said it and I missed it, how much of whatever ends up being developed will actually be affordable housing? And does Milton get to determine that? I'm under the belief that Milton does have a chance to maximize that, right? Because
so We've talked about it in previous meetings, but I'm looking over my shoulder. I think my wife brought dinner up like an hour and a half ago. I missed it. The way that the guidelines are written, towns can require up to 10% of units to be deed restricted affordable, eligible for the subsidized housing inventory. So the thinking behind that guideline is, they want to give towns the ability to keep their head above water on 40B, but they didn't want it to be a kind of a free-for-all in terms of setting what's called inclusionary zoning. That's the affordability requirement. They didn't want to give towns free rein to set whatever inclusionary zoning number they wanted, because inclusionary zoning is expensive, right? You're creating units that you can't sell at a profit, right? And so as a developer, you've got to make up that money somewhere else. And so what towns can do is set a percentage at an unreasonably high level that no developer would ever do because it doesn't make economic sense. And now all of a sudden you've got zoning that no one can take advantage of because it's economically infeasible. So that's why they set that cap at 10%. They've also given towns the ability to, if you conduct what they call an economic feasibility analysis that demonstrates that in your town, in your real estate market, that it's economically feasible to have a 15% inclusionary requirement without kind of breaking the bank, and for developers, that if you can demonstrate that you can reasonably expect new development even at that higher level, they will allow you to go above that 10%. We have not yet conducted that economic feasibility analysis. I think we've had our hands full just getting the zoning done, but our zoning will include a 10% requirement. And I believe the planning board and other folks have indicated a desire to do that economic feasibility analysis to see if we can, crank that up a little bit. Because it's good, 10% is fine, but you can start to get ahead if you have more than 10%. Now, one thing that I will say is that, other requirements in the guidelines are compelling us to zone in that transit area for those 3-unit, parcels. That is a circumstance where you wouldn't be able to do inclusionary zoning in that zone, because if you have a 3-unit building, the lowest number of units that you could deed restrict is 1, and that's now 33% of that project, which is much more than 10%. Mm-hmm. So there is going to be a portion of our zoning district where we just can't do inclusionary zoning. But on the bigger parcels with the bigger buildings, we'll absolutely have that 10% requirement. And I have a strong suspicion that we'll pursue, that analysis that may allow us to go up higher.
Okay, thanks. One last quick question then. I just have, does the law make any allowances for designated historic homes, historic districts or neighborhoods or streets? I mean, we've got Milton Hill, Blue Hills Parkway is on the National Register of Historic Places. Does any of that count for anything in any way?
No. So zoning is one type of land use regulation. Historic preservation, historic districts are another type. So in a sense, it's not great that it doesn't take that into account, because we've got to create zoning, and there's a portion of the Blue Hill Parkway that we've been trying to have that district match up with the current zoning, so that you're not going to have a huge apartment building that's not currently contemplated under current zoning. It's going to be, there are 2 and 3 family houses on the parkway already. The setbacks are going to be very similar, if not the same. The heights are going to be very similar, if not the same. So we're trying to sort of zone for as similar a housing product as exists now as we possibly can. And then on the other end, we haven't zoned Milton Hill. And that was the decision that the planning board made, with again, the planning principle being, it's a National Register historic district. There's a lot of historic areas in town. The whole town is lovely in its own way. But when you've got that kind of official designation that you can say, like, look, we don't want to put these houses at risk, we're just not going to bother zoning for them. So we've kind of carved out the National Register district at Milton Hill out of it. Now, the other thing is, one of the other things we'll see at town meeting is a vote on a local historic district in Milton Village, which is going to put protection on Milton Village. It's going to create design standards for any new development that happens in Milton Village if town meeting decides to pass it. So that's something where even though we're rezoning in Milton Village, we'll still have, again, if town meeting passes it, we will still have that protection for those for those buildings, so that those two sets of land use regulations are going to have to work together. You're not going to be able to build in Milton Village unless you satisfy the requirements of the historic district as well as the zoning.
Well, that's good to hear. Thanks a lot. I appreciate your feedback. Okay.
Yeah, you're welcome. Good questions.
Thank you, Joe. We have Sam Kaplan. Sam, you can unmute yourself.
Thanks, guys. You know what? I think most of my questions were just answered on the previous speaker, but just want to make sure I understand this correctly. So let's say my neighbor has, an acre and a half of land in in one of the zones. Realistically, he could sell to the highest bidder, which could be a developer, and he could come in and build, multifamily units on that property.
Yeah, I mean, depending on which. Sam, could you turn your volume down or something? Okay, great. Sorry about that. I'm not the tech guy, so I just mute yourself and you'll be good. So depending on which district it is, we'll determine like how much can be built. Most of the larger districts that we have, so Granite Ave, Milton Village, are set to a kind of maximum units per acre. So it's not like you've got an acre and a half of land and you can build 1 million units in a 10,000 story tower. There are going to be zoning parameters on that are going to, limit the number of units there. And the big one is going to be that kind of maximum units per acre parameter. I think in a situation where, you personally are living in a single family house, the odds are your neighbor is also in a single family house. And if you're in the zoning district, he can build 3 units and that's going to be it. There are certain places where some of the bigger districts border some of the single family neighborhoods, in which case you'll have to look at those parameters. But, in most of the areas where we've got single family houses, we've tried to kind of just keep that, that density level as low as we can possibly get it.
Got it. Understood. Appreciate that. And the what is it? RKG, who did the analysis? Did they look at any what could potentially happen to property values with some of this redevelopment going on? Just because I'm thinking if there's a lot of multifamily development going on in residential areas with single family homes, that could impact property values for current homeowners.
I don't know if they've specifically looked at that. That wasn't necessarily something that was asked of them. But what I will say is this on 2 different angles, and I don't have the analysis at my fingertips, but I've actually I may work this up and just kind of share it with folks, because I've actually done this out of my own curiosity to kind of see what the effect of kind of large scale multifamily development was on kind of surrounding single family home values. And it bears out in Milton. It bears out in academic studies that have been done on developments across the country that there is no appreciable decrease in property values as a result of multifamily development. And I think a lot of that is kind of based on a little bit of a kind of misinterpretation of what multifamily housing is and what's kind of generating it. If someone builds a big apartment building on your street or next door to your house, that's actually that's not causing things. That's the effect of things, and it's the effect of intense demand to live in an area. And so the demand that's compelling or incentivizing redevelopment of a large multifamily building has also raised up your property value. And so it's kind of a lagging indicator of the desirability of a neighborhood or a region. The other thing that I'll say is if you're looking at zoning districts, and it kind of, it doesn't work out for people that are just on the other side of the line, but if, when we draw that line around the transit area triplex, everyone in that district is getting new property rights if the zoning passes. Today, you can only build 1 house. Tomorrow, you can build 3 units. And a property that has one house on it is not worth as much as a property that could have 3 units on it. So again, you may not want to ever sell your house. You may love it to death. It's been in the family for 1,000 years, and you're perfectly entitled to hang on to your single family house. But you also have the ability to redevelop it for a higher, and it's a real estate term, higher and better use, from 1 unit to 3 units. And so within that zoning district itself, everyone's property values go up because everyone now has the ability to develop more intensively. And so I think it's a concern that we hear a lot. But I think sort of it's kind of based on maybe an outmoded kind of understanding of the quality of new multifamily housing. And again, which is a reflection of a real estate market where demand is red hot. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, no, appreciate that, Tim. I mean, final comment here, and I'll let you guys go. But I mean, the fact that we consider the Milton line or the Mattapan trolley to be rapid transit is kind of ridiculous. And I know it's not you guys, but it took me an hour and a half to get from South Station to the Milton Landing stop today. So, I mean, it's not you. I get it.
No, and I tend to be a T booster because, like I said, it's the only transit system we've got. But also, my eyes are wide open. I went to a show in Fenway a couple weeks ago, and I don't know, I almost fell asleep on the train home because it was taking so long. It was so late. It's a function of we have not maintained the T to the level that we need to over the course of decades, and it's a big problem. But again, the state, at least the housing agency, is operating under the assumption that it's important, it's a priority, and it'll get better. And those trains will start running a little bit faster. So hopefully we see some improvements with the track work they do in October. When we can start to get back on track, pun intended. We've got a couple more hands.
Mark Christo's next. Mark, we can't hear you. I think, Mark, you might need to change your sort of input settings, but we'll go next to Douglas Hine, and once we can hear you, we'll jump back to you.
Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you, as always, for your excellent work, and sorry we're getting your suppers cold. So I want to talk about the mandatory mixed-use district, and I know this is, I think, about 6 weeks fresh from the guidelines, so maybe there's still some cloudiness to this, but it's my read that any kind of unit capacity within, like reasonable unit capacity within that created district counts against our total that we need to come up with. But I guess my bigger question is, how do we factor this in to compliance? Because again, if my read is correct, you have to first get permission that your district complies. We haven't even created one yet, and so I don't know how that would fit in. I would love it if it would, because I love the idea of creating a neighborhood that has actual amenities, or at least preserving what we have. And so I'm glad that the Commonwealth considered this. I just don't know how we do it by December 4th. So maybe if you could speak to that a little bit, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah. So it's an interesting set of questions, and I have to confess that I don't have 100% grasp on it, and I say that in a spirit of humility, and also in a spirit of just the exceptional complexity of how the state has had to create these, because again, I said this earlier, but like what they're trying to do is kind of shoehorn a land use requirement into a law that very, very explicitly deals with a completely different land use. And these things may not look completely different to the naked eye, but in land use law, multifamily and mixed use might as well be industrial and farmland. They're different. And so when the law says multifamily, it just means multifamily. So they've had to try to figure out a way to kind of snake this into their guidelines in a way that's not intuitive and kind of has created, I don't want to say problems, but unanticipated issues for work that had been going on for 6 months, and now all of a sudden we're kind of dealing with this. So just in very general terms, what I will say is, my read from HLC is that the guidelines kind of are very kind of specific, but it's also kind of like very like, wink, wink. Your multifamily district is not a 3A district, but we're going to consider them all at the same time. So it's a separate district, but also, we will, if we elect to avail ourselves of the option, we will submit that to the state at the same time as we submit our 3A districts. And they will interact in kind of the ways that they need to interact, because even though the unit capacity, and we get a break on the unit capacity if we have mandatory mixed use. The state says if you're doing mandatory mixed use, your unit capacity can go down a certain percentage, so don't worry. But also that means we don't get credit for the density in the mandatory mixed use district. So those Milton Village districts were big density boosts for us under the normal circumstances. Because they're technically not 3A districts, we don't get that density boost from those kind of, bigger kind of apartment building projects.
Tim, has anybody pushed back on that? I mean, to say that we're going to get credit for the units, but not the density, makes zero sense to me. And I understand that everybody's kind of doing this on the fly. But when you're talking about changes this massive, and we're talking about the very precious resource in town that is our tiny little fledgling commercial district, which I'd love to see blossom, this is an important question. And maybe the folks at the Commonwealth don't even know, but have we asked that question about what justifies counting the number of units, but not the density? That doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, I think, and I'm open to correction on this by people who know more, and there's certainly people that know more about this, but that basically what the guidelines are saying is that if you elect to have so we're responsible for 2461 units. We can create a mandatory mixed use district that includes up to 25% of that number. So whatever 25% of 2461 is, we can create a district with a unit capacity of that amount. And then what they say is, now your new overall unit capacity is 2461 minus whatever is in your mandatory mixed use district. So it's kind of like, it's like a wash. So we get credit for the actual physical district, right? And that's important for contiguity purposes, because we have to have a district that represents 50% of the area that is contiguous. So that's good that we still get that. But we don't get the units towards unit capacity, but also our unit capacity number is lower by virtue of having the mandatory mixed use district. If this sounds crazy, it's because it is. It took everyone weeks to even begin to wrap their heads around this. The thing about the density not counting is, again, because in the very strictest legal sense, the mandatory mixed use district is not a 3A district. So they've tried to figure out all the different tricks and traps to give you as much credit for 3A as you can with these, but you just can't get credit for the density, because technically that density is not contributing to your 3A district, because it's not technically part of your 3A district. And so it's complicated and frankly problematic. I think overall, the importance of doing it outweighs the fact that, we're not getting that density boost, because we've been able to kind of get to our overall compliance numbers in a reasonable way through other means. But it is a real pain in the neck to not get that. And it's caused us to have to make some other decisions elsewhere. So I think that I've seen, pushback in the sense of, planners and officials from different towns saying, like, what were you guys thinking? Why is it like this? It's needlessly complicated, seems unfair. And they're basically like, this is the only way. And, unfortunately, because the legislation itself is so sparse, it gives the guidelines a lot of latitude in a lot of ways, but also handcuffs them in really serious ways. 15 units per acre, for instance, there's no relief from that. It's in the law. Multifamily, there's no relief from that. There's no change to that. It's in the law, and that's manifesting itself in very weird ways.
Awesome. I appreciate that explanation. Thanks, guys.
Yep. And it was helpful for me to kind of walk through that, because I've been kind of like sleepwalking through this stuff and kind of being like, I don't know, but it doesn't make a lot of sense, but it makes as much sense as it can. It's like a Zen thing. We've got Joe is our last hand of the evening. Joe, if you want to unmute yourself.
Joe, you're still muted.
So can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Actually, my question was answered with a couple of previous questions. But I'll just say, being the last guy, thanks for everything you guys did. I know it was a lot of work. Appreciate all you guys, what you do.
Thank you very much, Joe. Appreciate the kind words. This was a great session, gang. A lot of really good and important questions. So thanks everyone for coming. Thanks everyone for participating. Wish we could have been together at the COA. We will, the time between now and town meeting is running out. But I do think that we'll want to probably have, if not another public forum like this one, some other type of kind of final, update prior to town meeting. Just so you can have all the information at the ready to kind of talk to your town meeting members. If you are a town meeting member, I hope we've got some in attendance. But we'll want to make sure that, whatever is going to the warrant committee, whatever is going to wind up on your warrant, we have an opportunity to kind of, meet together and talk about it before town meeting. Obviously, town meeting is the big event, and everyone who's there will have an opportunity to ask their questions and make their comments and make themselves heard. But we'll want to make sure that everyone is prepared as possible going into town meeting. So don't have a timeline on that, don't have a schedule, but our intent is to have a kind of at the very least a final update. But if you want to follow in real time, planning board talks about MBTA communities every 2 weeks, sometimes every week, which is what they've been doing. And obviously the select board will more than likely have MBTA communities on their agenda. Both of those boards take public comment. I am, your humble town planner. Josh is your humble assistant town planner. We're not the decision makers. So if you want to get direct access to those folks, they meet on Tuesdays and Thursdays during the month. So thanks everyone for coming. This recording will be posted on the planning department website. The presentation will be posted on the planning department website. If you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to Josh or myself, and have a great night. Thanks a lot.
Thank you all.